Joining me today is a professor of communication and political science at The Ohio State University, whose research focuses on how the media shapes public opinion on issues like vaccines, climate change, and political polarization. He's also the co-author of We Need to Talk: How Cross-Party Dialogue Reduces Effective Polarization. Professor Dominik Stecuła, thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me.
So to start off, your research sits at the intersection of political communication, science communication, and public opinion, with a focus on how the media shapes what people believe on issues like vaccines or climate change. So just to start off, how do you define propaganda and how does it differ from misinformation more broadly?
Uh, yeah, so propaganda is more of an old school term, and it is mostly understood as this deliberate, systematic attempt to shape perceptions and essentially manipulate people in some way. So the goal is usually to kind of serve some sort of purpose of whoever the propagandist is. So in that sense, propaganda doesn't need to be false necessarily, right? It can be truthful information presented in like a very selective way. It can use things like framing, omission, basic like emotional appeals, right? So like things like that. Misinformation, as it kind of stands in the contemporary scholarship, is this broader umbrella term for essentially inaccurate or misleading information, depending on how you look at it, with or without intent. So, in some scholars make this big deal of the kind of intent. So, like for example, right, if you like forward an email that you got from your grandma or something to some other people, and that email contains some fabricated statistics, but you think they were correct. That's misinformation. But if you knew that it was incorrect and you're still passing it on, that's disinformation because that's like you trying to deceive other people, right? So, but of course, intent is difficult to measure, right? We frequently don't know the intent of the person. So, for all intents and purposes, people can abandon that part of it, and misinformation is this broad umbrella term for essentially things are inaccurate or misleading, right? So,
Interesting.
so misinformation is kind of this broader umbrella term that kind of includes more or less everything from like honest mistakes to some sort of broader coordinated influence operations. But propaganda is this much broader thing, and a big distinction with misinformation is that it doesn't need to be false, right? Like propaganda could be truthful information presented selectively. So I think that would be like the kind of big picture distinction between the two.
Definitely. So a key thread running through your research is the idea that political identity shapes how people receive any information. So how does political identity change the way that people process facts, and when does it become a misinformation issue as opposed to just a political one?
Mhm. So there's been some really interesting work on this, and I think essentially, I think that the person who shaped me the most in this domain is this scholar named Denka Han, and Denka Han has this idea of he calls it identity protective cognition, or sometimes it's called cultural cognition. But the big idea there is that when kind of factual questions become entangled with group identity, people process information in a way that protects their standing in the group rather than reflects like the truth. Right. So he had this experiment, which was really neat, where they essentially had this large representative sample of Americans, and they did essentially this like math test first, so that he kind of knew how good at just basic uh, mathematical reasoning people were, just whether you could understand basic, like read a crosstab, that kind of thing. And and then he randomly assigned people into different conditions, and people were essentially made to read this result of an experiment and make sense of a table. And the numbers were all the same, except the framing changed. So some people were thought they're reading about um, data of like a skin cream that is supposed to prevent a rash. and other people are randomly assigned to read about, again, same presentation of information, same numbers, same tables, except they thought it was about gun control and safety in cities. And other people, skin cream or gun control, right? And it turned out that probably just as you would predict, the better you are at math, the better you were at like answering the factual questions about the skin cream, right? So when the issue was about the skin cream, which like nobody really cares about, right? Like it doesn't affect Republicans or Democrats in a different way. So you just made sense of the table and you were able to correctly answer questions. However, if you were randomly assigned to the gun control question, all of a sudden being better at math made you a lot less likely to answer the question correctly. Because all of a sudden, that wasn't just being good at math, it was being good at math plus reading about an issue you cared about, right? So if you were conservative, you were only good at reading the table if it confirmed your belief. If you were liberal, you were only good at reading the table if it confirmed your belief about gun control, right? So it's really a really clever way of showing that identity charged issues, and it's increasingly more and more issues, right? Climate change, gun policy, whatever. The more numerate, the more scientifically literate people, they're not less polarized as you would probably like suspect if you were just like a random person of the street, right? Usually you would say like, okay, like smarter people measured through education, they would just be better at this stuff. But it's actually not, right? Like smarter people are actually better at kind of rationalizing their positions and actually being more polarized. So I think this is really how identity shape perception, right? Like if you're doing something and that something isn't really tied about an identity that's useful to you, and increasingly a political identity is something that's really a big part of how people see themselves, right? So if it's not tied to an identity, if it's about like buying a fridge or whatever, then like you can like process information in like an unbiased way. But if you are processing information about something that's tied to something that really matters to you, so it's something political, increasingly a lot of science issues like vaccines, climate change, right? Gun control, abortion, you name it, right? All of a sudden, how you process information becomes not really like a rational thing of you just evaluating evidence, but you kind of filter it through your identity, right? And to kind of get back to your question, like when it becomes misinformation, well, it becomes misinformation when the belief in question is like empirically wrong, right? So it's not just merely about like contested values, but about like factual claims that we know are incorrect, right? Um, it becomes misinformation when like acting on it produces like measurable harm. So, for example, refusing vaccines, right? Or ignoring climate adaptation, that kind of thing. Um, and when the partisan signal has kind of crowded out the corrective signal, right? So I think all in all, it's increasingly the case where in our politics, more and more issues become kind of tied to politics, which then by extension means that when we think about issues, we increasingly don't just think of them as issues, for example, of science or whatever the domain of that they might be in, but as things that are just tied to kind of how we see ourselves and how we pursue kind of social standing within our group, right? So we don't just want to be correct. We want to be a member in good standing of Team Republican or Team Democrat or another form of identity or whatever. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So, in a world where we can't necessarily control the framing of the information that's coming to us, and where we can't necessarily decide for ourselves if this information is going to be, if we're going to be looking at the gun control issue or the rash cream issue, is, is there anything we can do to sort of parse through all of the framing to get to the actual facts and better sort of see the issue for what it is?
Well, there there's a lot of things you can do, right? I mean, increasingly it just becomes very difficult to kind of curate your information environment because it used to be very simple, right? Like if you just wanted to be like an informed adult, right? You would just like subscribe to a newspaper and watch the news, and most of the news you watch on TV were more or less the same, right? Most of the newspapers were kind of giving you the same kind of stuff. So we were roughly all on the same page because we were all consuming, information that's produced through these traditional kind of gatekeepers where people were trained journalists and they kind of fact check things and did all these things behind the scenes so that we could just kind of consume the information and just go with that, right, and form our opinions based on that. But of course now it's a very different landscape, right? Most people don't read the newspapers. Most people, even some still watch TV, usually older folks, right? But it's not the traditional broadcast television. It's more kind of explicitly partisan news on cable that they watch, right? And like a lot of folks get information on the internet and through social media where it's algorithmically driven to them, right? So it's not just like kind of organically, they're not organically encountering it, right? They're kind of being fed specific information based on their past behavior on a specific site. So it's like a lot harder, right, to just simply be your own, curating your own feed, curating your own kind of unbiased forms of kind of information diet because it just takes a lot of work. There's a lot of information out there, right? And that's just a lot of work you need to do on your end because the traditional gatekeepers are kind of they matter a lot less, right? So there's these big structural issues that we need to worry about. But I think in general people should be skeptical. There's things you can do like, checking things and trying to if a claim that makes their way to them is something that seems like it's too good to be true or kind of outlandish that probably means it is, so see if other kind of reputable sources are reporting on it, right? There's like certain things you can do, but if we zoom out and we just think about the big picture stuff, it's just like a very different environment for kind of you to navigate as a young person in 2026 than it would have been for me when I was your age in like the early 2000s, and it would have been for somebody else in the 90s, right? It just like it takes a lot more work for you to kind of get good, credible information in your feed. So I think that's part of the problem, right? Structurally, we're kind of swimming against the tide where we're just drowning in a lot of information, and some of it is really good, and some of it is really bad.
Definitely. So, as you spoke about, your research found that traditional media users were less likely to hold, in this case, vaccine misinformation than social media users, but also that a separate important factor was trust in medical experts and whether people updated their beliefs at all. So, given that both the the platforms people use, and their level of trust in experts seem to matter independently, how do the two coexist and interact in shaping whether misinformation is actually effective?
Yeah, so there's different layers here, right? So like first there's like the selection issue, right? So like people who already distrust experts kind of choose an information environment that already reflects that, right? In a sense. So like it's probably highly unlikely that if you distrust experts, you could like read the New York Times or watch like the CBS Evening News, right? Like you're probably listening to some like niche podcasts and maybe you're part of some groups on Signal or um you follow certain accounts on X or on Facebook or more fringe social media platforms, right? So the platform itself like isn't randomly assigned, right? You kind of select into a platform and then so we should be mindful of that, right? Like I don't necessarily spend a lot of time on like Truth Social or listening to some weird podcast. I mean, I listen to weird podcasts, but I guess not specifically these kinds of weird podcasts, right? So there's the selection issue. Then there's the exposure, right? So even kind of net of selection, platform algorithms differ in kind of what content they surface, right? So there's like all this work suggests that like the supply side effect is real, meaning that part of what makes a lot of platforms appealing is that they just learn a lot about us over time, and then they just give us the content that they know we would engage with, right? So even if we're broadly speaking into similar things, like we might not be seeing the same things on the same platform, partly because we behaved slightly differently on that platform. But like there's the selection into the platform, then there's the exposure, right, which is a function of the algorithm and the previous behavior. And then there's the receptivity, right? So like the same kind of false claim will land differently depending on whether the audience trusts certain institutions or not, right? So I think kind of how those things interact is that like the kind of platform exposure matters most, right? When trust is kind of already eroded because trust functions as this kind of filter that determines which content people accept, right? So targeting platforms without addressing trust is like treating a symptom, but not the underlying thing, right? So I think that's kind of how I think about it, right? Like the two definitely interact. But like my broader kind of, I think, lesson from a lot of this literature is that we tend to think of misinformation and platforms as purely like a supply issue, right? Like it just like this information kind of exists for various reasons, and if we just kind of stop it from existing, then it will be fine. And I think we need to grapple with the demand side of things, right? Like there's a lot of misinformation simply because people want it, right? There's certain platforms exist and they're doing well because they tailor to their user base, right? And they give them the type of misinformation that they crave, right? And if they don't find it there, then they'll just move on to a different platform. So I think misinformation being not just a supply side issue, but a demand side issue is something that I think is worth thinking about. And like I had this study when we looked at kind of medical misinformation during COVID. And we had this uh, when we're doing it, Facebook experienced an outage, and we were able to kind of track people's search behavior during that outage. And when people were kind of deprived of being able to access Facebook because it was just globally out, uh, some people just went and they navigated their browser to like specific sources of like misinformation websites, right? So like places like InfoWars, Natural News, Mercola.com, which is like this website of this former Dr. Joe Mercola, who spread a lot of kind of health-related misinformation, especially during COVID, right? So like that shows us that this is not just a supply side issue. This is a demand side issue, right? For a lot of people, they just really want misinformation. And when Facebook is down and they can't get it there, they'll just like go to the website directly, right? And get it that way. So that's kind of, I think, my big takeaway for this is that let's be mindful of not just the supply, but demand as well.
Yeah, you spoke a bit about this, but in your work regarding COVID-19, you found that people who distrusted experts and institutions were more likely to believe conspiracy theories and sometimes seek them out about the
Mhm.
virus, even after accounting for their political affiliation. So, what does that relationship tell us between institutional distrust and conspiracy belief about how this misinformation actually even takes hold in the first place?
Yeah, so a lot of this is just down to these deeper worldviews, right? So there's we measured it through kind of thin populism, which is populism just is this broader idea that some people just distrust elites, and those elites can be different people, right? Like they could be like political elites, like politicians, right? It could be like financial elites, like just wealthy people, like bankers, right? Like venture capitalists, that kind of thing. Could be like professors, right? Or actors, like cultural elites. But for whatever reason, there's like a sub group within the population, between 10 and 20% of the people, who just develop these strong distrust of elites, right? And they just view um, just our society and politics especially as this kind of struggle between the kind of the good people and the bad elites, right? So this is just like a deeper worldview, right? And when you have that worldview, you're just much more likely to accept misinformation. And I think that what this shows us is that um, kind of fixing, quote unquote, this broader problem of misinformation um, by just trying to focus on just like what made up claims circulate on social media ignores these deeper predispositions that some people have and those deeper worldviews that some people have that like to really, think strategically about misinformation as a problem. I think we need to grapple with the fact that like some people are simply wired in a certain way psychologically, and they just kind of view this kind of content as appealing to them. It checks a lot of their boxes, right? It provides usually, it lines up with all these other psychological predispositions, like like need for closure, right? Need for um, uh, essentially, simple explanations for complex problems, right? Like a lot of kind of conspiracies and misinformation check these boxes, so people are gravitating towards it. But this is something that you can't really fix with like a fact check or a debunk, right? Because this is like this deeper thing that people have been frequently socialized into, right? So that is not an easy fix when you have like a part of the population. Again, it's not a massive amount of people necessarily, but like big enough, right? Where they have these deeper predispositions, and that just makes them more open to a lot of false claims, especially false claims that are structured in a way that taps into some of these insecurities and deeper distrust they have of different elites.
You've also examined not only what information is being produced and circulated, but also what psychological and political conditions even make people receptive to it in the first place. And
Mhm.
most of the public conversation about misinformation does focus on, like you spoke about, debunking these specific false claims. But what is examining both the production of the misinformation and the conditions that make people open to it reveal about why debunking falls short so often?
So I think there's a few things, right? One is the kind of thing we just talked about, right? If it's this deeper worldview that you have, if you're like a truly a populist, more conspiratorial person, right? Then you're just open to these kinds of claims because these claims really kind of fit your broader worldview, right? So I think that's an important part of this, right? Another part of this is like I think in general we have research that shows that like debunking can be effective, right? But like the problem is that like let's say you're just like an average person, right? And you follow certain accounts on social media. Odds are you don't also follow like factcheck.org, right? You probably don't start your day going to factcheck.org or right, you're not going to see that content, right? So like part of it is just like the venue problem. Misinformation comes at you from the sources you frequently chose to follow, so you trust. Whereas the corrections come from other sources that like you might not even see. And if you do end up seeing them, um, because of the trust and other issues, like you just are a lot less likely to take them seriously, right? So I think that's ultimately the biggest problem with fact checking is that like it can work, but it is usually occurring in a different venue than where the misinformation exposure originally took place. And the kind of person who goes on factcheck.org is probably not the kind of person that necessarily needs to go on factcheck.org, right? And the person that needs to go on factcheck.org is probably very unlikely to go on factcheck.org because they don't trust it. They think it's just like a bunch of academics and journalists who are just lackeys for one political party, and they're not trustworthy in your mind, right? So I think that's kind of how I would summarize this.
Yeah, moving on a little bit. Your book, We Need to Talk, tests whether
Mhm.
Democrats and Republicans who can talk directly with each other actually become less hostile toward one another. And what did that research tell us about whether direct contact across political lines can change how people engage with information that they would otherwise normally reject?
Yeah, so I think talking to people face to face is just like a really productive way of engaging. And we brought people. into these different venues around Philadelphia, which is where I was at the time. And so it was like libraries, community centers, etc. And we would have these structured conversations. And talking in person, I think that the reason why it worked and why it kind of lowered polarization in our study and in other studies, so it's like a fairly consistent finding. The reason why it works is that, like, how you talk to people in person is just like a little different than how you talk to people online, right? So like in online settings, frequently you have like anonymity, but even if you don't, right? If like I comment on your post on some social media platform, right? Like it's a lot more likely that like we can just like start arguing or whatever, just simply because like we don't know each other, right? So like there's no social penalty for just saying mean things, right? But of course, that's not how it works in face-to-face conversation, because unless you're like a sociopath, right? You're trying to be nice, you're trying to kind of engage with the other person, etc. So I think the in-person component can be useful because when you bring people together, um, people in general just kind of realize, and that's what we found in our data, that what they imagine in their head as who the quote unquote other side is. So like if you're a Democrat, like how you envision what the Republican is frequently mediated by your like social media interactions and your other media consumption, right? So you kind of think of the most extreme Republican as being like the model Republican. And same for Republicans, right? You think like every Democrat is, an extreme person from the far left. Like you think every Democrat is like an Ilhan Omar or AOC or Zoran Mamdani or something. But then when you show up and you're just talking across the table from somebody that kind of looks like you and also likes the same sports teams and you live in the same neighborhood, turns out, all of a sudden you have a lot to talk about and that person doesn't seem that bad, right? Like you might disagree on some things, but the other person is not like this caricature of what the kind of media wants you to kind of believe the other side is. So I think that's kind of the mechanism through which that works. But of course, the question then becomes, well, how do we scale it, right? People don't really talk to each other. Increasingly, a lot of our interactions are online, as I said earlier. Online, this doesn't replicate because online we don't talk to each other in the same way. That same norms don't transpire. So I think that becomes a question of like, what do we do with that, right? How do we encourage people to actually talk across their differences in a face-to-face setting? So I haven't cracked that code, but I think our work and some other work that has come out since shows us that this is like a really useful way to kind of lower the partisan temperature, is just to simply to talk to somebody and just try to understand their point of view.
Before we wrap up, I do want to hit on one of the fastest growing technologies that's impacting propaganda, which is artificial intelligence. And so, how have you seen it impacting the overall misinformation landscape? And do you think it's generally just accelerating what was already going on, or is it making substantial changes to the way that we even engage with this propaganda or misinformation?
It's tricky because I don't know, and those models keep changing, which is the technology is growing at an exponential rate. I think simply by how a lot of these AI tools are, meaning like, we're mostly talking about, I think, like chatbots, which is how most people interact with generative AI tools, right? Like ChatGPT or Gemini or Perplexity or Claude or whatever your tool of choice is. Most, I think, civilians, right, interact with generative AI through the chatbots. And like, right, chatbots are very different than like Googling something, right? Because like, it's not like you don't put in your question and then you get like a list of links and you have to go to some website and read stuff, right? Like it gives you like a prepared answer, right? And because of the fact that it's like a conversation, because there's this almost like a parasocial relationship, right? Like we talk to these machines like they're human beings, like they're our friends. I mean, we've seen all this work where like like some people just they try to marry the chatbot, right? And they develop like friendship with the chatbot, right? So these are like deep psychological connections they develop with the tool, which that makes the what the tool says very persuasive, right? So that means it could be very scary if the content that people are able to get out of these chatbots is, full of misinformation or some sort of broader propaganda where there's like some sort of nefarious way of trying to sway public opinion, right? Because when you just Google something, you can get on some website, click on a link, and be like, well, I don't trust this website. But when it's the chatbot you trust that's giving you an answer that sounds pretty definitive, because they always give you an answer that sounds pretty definitive, it has a much more persuasive power, right? Than just like being able to click on a link that takes you to some website. So I think that means it can be quite scary, right? Now, there's not a lot of good research on this yet because partly because the tools are still relatively new, partly because they keep changing. Um, but we do have work that shows that chatbots can be persuasive in uh, dispelling certain misinformed notions and kind of making people walk away from maybe some of the kind of conspiratorial views they might have, right? So there's some scholars who kind of essentially embedded chatbots into surveys and are able to kind of present people with like some information, and then you kind of talk to a chatbot, and it seems like in that context, in the studies that I've seen, you are able to kind of persuade people much more effectively than with like other forms of persuasion, that like a certain claim is misinformed or conspiratorial. So like kind of evidence can kind of point both ways, right? Like you can both see how these tools can be used to kind of push propaganda and make misinformation even more widespread. But at the same time, I think when they're used in a way to kind of counter these things, they can be used effectively to counter these claims too. So what will it ultimately end up being? I don't know, right? Probably depends on the tool and depends on the person that's using it. But I think it can honestly go both ways. It can supercharge misinformation, or it can kind of be at least at the margins like a force for good in terms of correcting some of the claims.
Definitely. To close, I do want to end on a little bit more of a grounded everyday note. So, what is one piece of advice you would give to someone trying to think more critically and engage with the propaganda or misinformation that they encounter every day?
You know, I think I wouldn't say like there's like one advice. Like in terms of like just be skeptical and double check is definitely if I had to boil it down to one thing. But I think a broader point would be, try to consume information outside of just social media. And I don't mean necessarily just like subscribe to like a newspaper or magazine or something, but definitely try to make it a habit where it's not just through your algorithmic feed that you get information, because um, that's how you can fall prey to a lot of stuff, right? So like if you want to be informed, just make an effort to like go to some credible website. And again, it can be New York Times, it can be, I mean, Fox News, it can be whatever you're into politically, but like just try to actually use a source or a set of sources and make an effort to kind of try to consume information in a way that's not just depending on you being fed content by an algorithm, because what feeds the algorithm is like all the bad things that makes it's all emotionally charged. It's meant to kind of tap into the most kind of primal urges that we all have. It's all meant to kind of exploit you emotionally, and I think it's just be good to be mindful of that and try to kind of take control of the information you intake by just kind of seeking it out in other venues.
Amazing. Thank you so much for being here, Professor Stecuła.
Oh, thanks for having me.